Thanks very much, and good afternoon, fellow infidels, and welcome to the future. It's a pleasure to be amongst so many agreeably sensible people, many of whose idea of religion, I imagine, does not go much beyond reading The Guardian, which one does ritually every morning, of course. I take it that we can probably see humanism as entailing an ethical commitment to our common well-being without recourse to divine sanctions, mythical pretense, or undue psychological manipulation by governments, churches, or the press. Humanism is antithetical to faith in anything beyond the scope of empirical observation. Yet it is, of course, far from being a merely negative ideal. For humanists have, I think at least, an agenda to promote, which I would define as one of secular sociability, which involves fostering a kind of friendship or cooperation on a broadly egalitarian basis. To achieve this, we must battle constantly against our particular dragon, superstition. The Enlightenment project, as it's sometimes called, if conceptually a bit murky at times, still inspires us. Thomas Paine, Robert Owen, John Stuart Mill, and the other opponents of priestcraft, the subjects of most of my own career of academic research, remain guiding lights, I think, still today, as do most of their successors, notably the Darwinians. But we must recognize our own limits, and indeed our failings. We may not, with Marx, worship at the altar of historical necessity. Kant's religion of humanity did not prove a success either. We aim to walk then, but without crutches. We aim to see, but without blinkers. These are noble aims, and it's worth reminding ourselves of the long road already behind us when we suffer setbacks. For it cannot be said that victory lies within our grasp. Indeed, our hopes of success seem rather to be slipping away. Our opponents, emboldened as ever by the conceit of divine conversation and their supposed monopoly on eternity, provoke us into a new age of confrontation. A Catholic bishop recently urged all Christians to display a cross. I wonder perhaps if humanists should adorn themselves with some symbol of their notional virtues, perhaps some sort of shield of reason emblazoned with an image of the printing press. Others, too, taunt us. The forgetful chairperson of the Conservative Party, Baroness Varsi, has prominently demonized aggressive secularism, though it is heartwarming that she seems to think we're winning. But intellectually, too, there are increasing challenges to what we might regard as our foundational historical premise, the theory of secularization, as philosophers like Charles Taylor reap rich rewards by waxing upon the eternal verities of Christianity. Let us consider then briefly today what the future, say the next 50 to 100 years, holds in store for us. There are broadly two kinds of images of the future, I think, those which project what we'd ideally like, and those which predict on the basis of the best available evidence what we are more likely to get. Heaven and utopia are of the former type. History and empirical analysis provide the latter. My own response today requires, firstly, some predictions, without, alas, the aid of tea leaves, chicken entrails, or crystal balls, and secondly, a willingness to suggest solutions to our great problems. Rather immodestly, I will attempt both. Big questions demand bold answers. And we will, of course, want to know, I think, here, how humanism intersects with the solutions proposed. Firstly, then, the problems. I've ranked the big five in descending order. I'm sure you all know what they are anyway. The greatest, overpopulation, is pretty obvious. Planet Earth has just admitted its 7th billionth customer to nature's mighty feast, as Malthus termed it, and we are projected to have between 15 and 20 billion in 80 to 100 years. We are running out of space, resources, privacy, opportunities. Try having a family picnic in downtown Shanghai. Life cheek by jowl is not particularly pleasant. We live on a small planet, we're devouring it rapidly. The last course at the feast is that old standby nettle soup. Any recipes? Start thinking. The environmental scenario is so stunningly obvious that I will not belabor the point. Read Malthus, whose moment has now finally arrived. Secondly, resource depletion, about which we heard a bit earlier today, follows logically on from this, though as you know, developed countries consume far more per capita than the less developed. This is no consolation for any of us either way. There is no technological fix here. We are an inventive species, but our stupidity, greed, and irrationality nearly always outweigh our creativity. Sorry, human beings. Thirdly, war has been a given throughout human history. Europeans are more or less at peace with each other for the first time in 3 generations. Yet enmity and resentment thrive and fester elsewhere. China, Japan, Russia and the West, Muslims, Jews, Christians, developing nations, former imperial and colonized peoples, immigrants, and long-established peoples all spring quickly to mind. Class exploitation, fourthly, has increased dramatically since the Reagan-Thatcher epoch, and with it the concentration of wealth. About 50% of the world's resources are now owned and or controlled by about 2% of the population. This would not be a problem, of course, if the 2% acted responsibly. But their god is mammon, and they do not. Instead, they destroy our jobs, our pensions, our health service, and anything else they can get their hands on. The current financial crisis, so-called, it's not really a good term for it, is the logical end product of criminal conspiracy by a financial plutocracy. Unregulated capitalism gave us the Great Depression and did much to produce fascism. Combined with personal and governmental profligacy, it threatens yet to destroy the European project. The growth of inequality also clearly undermines the diffusion of humanist values, for the wealthy have no interest in enlightening the many, and much in enslaving them. Fifthly, while science and technology are seen by many to be a part of the solution rather than the cause of mankind's problems, our race to modernize has produced many risky and unsafe technologies, notably nuclear power and nuclear weapons. Fukushimas will abound in the coming century if we do not reduce our dependency on nuclear power. Here in the domain of science, religious interference with some aspects of scientific research, particularly stem cell research, only retards beneficial developments. Finally, I've suggested that moral leadership is sadly lacking in the face of these problems. We just heard prospectively about what to do about this. The last 30 years have seen the popularization of a greed is good ideology, in which mercenary selfishness and the worst instincts of the least educated have increasingly dominated social, political, and economic life. Freed from restraint, the rich have outdone themselves in cupidity and have, moreover, successfully enticed the poor to worship at the same shrine, in the vain hope, and it is vain, that some crumbs from the table may fall their way. The main political parties have been generally confused by these developments when they are not actually abetting them. The task of facing our more difficult long-term problems has thus fallen to small, often isolated groups in civil society, as governments reduce taxes, privatize themselves, abrogate responsibility for the future, and destroy the ethos of the public space. The idea that the free market alone can provide for our collective individual well-being has failed, but this ideology remains immensely potent, and its opponents scattered, disillusioned, and ineffectual. Let me turn then to the solutions, also 5, and let's consider how humanism affects the issues I've raised so far. With population control, the answer is glaringly obvious. Papal and evangelical influence here remains decisive. One recent American Republican presidential hopeful, Rick Santorum, actually came out against all forms of contraception. We need to reduce the world's population. I think that's quite clear. But to do so justly and effectively is perhaps the single most contentious issue we can contemplate. This can be done humanely, or, much more likely, war, famine, and disease will do the job for us. Such were Malthus's alternatives to the traditional horsemen of the apocalypse, who were the harbingers of the Last Judgment. The humane alternative will not become viable, however, until women share rights fully with men everywhere and gain the ultimate choice over childbearing. Secondly, resource depletion. This is contingent, of course, on the population issue. We can enjoy a reasonable standard of living with, say, 10 billion people, but probably not with 15. 20 will bring mass slavery. We need to contemplate how we can compensate people for the lack of children they must have, which such controls will clearly necessitate. Welfare systems are also crucial. So too is restraint of consumption and the more efficient use of the resources we still possess. Thirdly, social and political antagonism. While wars continue and loom in various parts of the world, particularly in the Middle East, mutual self-interest has bound us together, along with enlightened foreign policy, more than ever before. There are still many sad deficiencies here, however, but we share much in common. Beyond our humanity and our natural sociability, we are increasingly connected by a common identity rooted in a global culture. A few, admittedly major apologies, just to take the Chinese case as a starter, for the Opium Wars, for Japan's brutal invasion of the 1930s, would be a good starting point in enhancing this global identity. This is not nearly as difficult as it appears. National egos can be assuaged, enemies can be forgiven. We have much more in common than we have apart. That, I think, is the core of the humanist message, as I read it. Hence, on to problem 4, class exploitation. The 19th and 20th centuries, of course, became obsessed with this issue. But neither communism nor capitalism have succeeded in bridging the gap between worker and capitalist. Social welfare and social justice are, however, certainly attainable. Richard Wilkinson and Kate Pickett's The Spirit Level, published in 2008, persuasively argues that these goals are most likely to be achieved in relatively equal societies in which managed capitalism coexists beside successful welfare systems. The Anglo-American model and the current financial crisis teach us that neoliberalism, unrestrained capitalism, is disastrous in principle. The capitalist leviathan can be mastered, however, by greater transparency, by more employee co-ownership, by mandating maximum proportionate salaries, by investment risk reduction, by increasing taxation justly, by ring-fencing pensions and welfare, and by ending tax avoidance. We might start with a small war on the Cayman Islands. Enough money, in fact, as you doubtless know, is hidden in tax-evading accounts to pay the debts of all of the European countries. We have, however, yet to agree on the collective wish for social justice. Perhaps we have begun to do so, but our adversaries have enormous power and an army of dragons to set upon us. For following our sad propensity for trading one set of superstitions for another, we worship, if anything, even more fervently at the altar of an ersatz god, usually called the market, or more polytheistically, the markets, today, than ever we did in churches and chapels. These monsters are so powerful as to intimidate every government in the world. And so long, too, as we remain bedazzled by the tinseled trappings of excessive wealth and the intoxication of luxury, we will never tame these beasts. Finally, then, there's the question of what I've described as moral corruption and its antidote, moral leadership. I mean by corruption here a willingness to subordinate to an intoxicating hedonism all other values, including our duties to ourselves, to others, to the planet, and to posterity. The ideology of freedom of choice dominates later modernity. But as faith declines, choice itself is increasingly commodified and reduced to short-term material satisfactions. Choosing the red striped toothpaste over the blue stripe becomes a meaningful, empowering decision whose promise heralds freedom, beauty, prowess, eternal youth. Reality TV trumps reality. Winning the talent show is living the dream. A winner-takes-all mentality pervades. Constant manipulation by the press and great corporations produces the new late modern superstition that happiness is defined by material consumption. We suffer accordingly from an acute shortage of moral commitment. Newspaper editors do not know what the word ethics means. The Goebbels of Fleet Street, Mr. Murdoch, if you'll forgive the harsh expression, might know, but probably doesn't care. Fox News USA surely is evidence enough of this. And for every Dawkins and Hitchens on our team, there's a Coulson, a Brooks, an Express, a Daily Mail, conspiring to misinform us and keep us in hapless stupidity. In government, we have few statesmen but many politicians who are outsourced corporate clones too often, whose sense of duty stops with their shareholders. In social philosophy, the mumbo-jumbo of postmodernist relativism, too, drives us towards decadence and moral ambivalence. These failings can be countered only by a counter-assertion of cosmopolitan, post-religious humanist values. We must reject the monstrous propaganda machine which dictates that our chief behavioral model should be a glamorous, vampire-slaying, Beverly Hills teenage millionaire. It's a long phrase. And we must restore a sense of public duty to the political sphere, for which we require, of course, in turn, a new definition of our collective good. Since the early 19th century, then, humanism has achieved a number of victories, but also suffered a number of defeats. Humanists aim to make life more valuable, and insofar as brutality, cruelty, and violence have been lessened, we can measure some progress. Humanists have been allied with the causes of social justice, rights, and social equality for much of the last 2 centuries. Millions have been released from oppressive religious belief systems, which foment anxiety, paranoia, and produce false promises. Yet millions more, and particularly women, have little choice over their destinies because of the persistence of such systems. Worse still, so-called faith-centered agendas, the word faith here palpably indicates an embarrassment about oppressive religious indoctrination, have been everywhere on the increase. In Britain, they are fomented lamentably by a series of governments for whom faith in anything trumps no faith at all in the supernatural. Coerced and insincere church attendance by parents anxious to enroll their children in sectarian schools is increasing. In my own patch of southwest London, a new Catholic school looks likely to be founded, despite, and I express my gratitude here for it, the BHA's best efforts to block it. But the state, I think we probably agree, should have no role in abetting any religion. This is the domain of private conscience. Schools should have no religious orientation where taxpayers' funds are involved, and should teach nothing but comparative religion, which is the best way of getting over religious belief I have ever seen. Our entire future hinges on education, and yet we are the 3rd most illiterate country in Europe. Why? In this matter, as a sop to multiculturalism, we've gone down the wrong track. This is, of course, highly exasperating. We rightly prize having preserved the rights of conscience and end up having no end of nonsense foisted upon us. And if Tony Blair only did God after departing office, we now have to contend with a prime minister who promotes a quote-unquote Christian fight back of more prayer and quote-unquote, again, the values of the Bible, like slavery and witch burning, as a means of appeasing his party's right wing. Let me end on a cautionary note. We wish to hasten that decline in religiosity which most of us believe to be inevitable. But as I've emphasized this afternoon, we can no longer gamble on this long-run strategy. There is now an urgency to our cause which dictates growing militancy on our part and an impatience with the plodding pace of rationalist progression. Religion constitutes an enormous, if not insurmountable, barrier which prevents us from confronting our own real future by displacing our concerns to eternity. This is, I think, the single greatest problem humanists can grapple with. The gravity of our potential fate will inevitably bring increasing confrontation with believers of all types. But humanists must themselves tolerate the greatest variety of private religious practice and offer the greatest respect to individual practitioners. We need to recognize sympathetically that religion functions to provide a sense of community for many. Indeed, the desire to belong probably produces the desire to believe much more strongly than we usually imagine. We usually think of it the other way around, I think. Our problem then is with theology, not with forms of sociability. Our battle is with delusional ideas, not with human beings. Our aim is critical thinking, not emotional damage and psychological destabilization. We seek to disenchant, but gently, may I say, humanely. Our key confrontation will continue to be with beliefs taken out of the church, chapel, and mosque, and into the hospital, the school, parliament, and in front of the abortion clinic. Here we must persevere, but we have no choice. The humanist utopia is a decent life for all based on reasonable principles. This noble vision is, with sufficient effort, attainable. Thank you all for whatever you can do towards attaining it.